Esta sesión del Foro de la Crítica, al igual que la mesa que ya pudieron atestiguar hace unas horas, esta clase magistral también tiene un sesgo, digamos, que tiene que ver con el cine experimental. Es algo que se había tratado anteriormente de manera tangencial, digamos, en anteriores sesiones del Foro de la Crítica, pero que esta vez queremos tratar de manera ya frontal. Para ello, pues tengo el gusto de presentar a Genevieve Yue, que esta sesión estará a cargo de esta clase magistral. Para mí es un gran gusto y voy a leer pues básicamente la semblanza de Genevieve, para no errar también, y para ya finalmente poder pasarle la palabra. Genevieve Yue es crítica y programadora de cine, es profesora adjunta de Cultura y Medios de Comunicación y directora de estudios de pantalla en la Eugene Land College de New School. Su investigación se centra en la organización formal y material de los medios audiovisuales, con énfasis en la historia y la teoría del cine. Los ensayos y críticas de Genevieve han aparecido en publicaciones como October, Grey Room, Art Agenda, Film Comment, Film Quarterly, Reverse Shot y The Times Literary Supplement. Ha organizado proyecciones de películas en Mass Art, Anthology Film Archives, Light Industry, el Wexner Center, Los Ángeles Film Forum y el Milwaukee Underground Film Festival. Actualmente forma parte del Consejo de Administración del Flaherty Seminar, donde también preside el Comité de Programación. Es doctora en Estudios Críticos por la School of Cinematic Arts de la Universidad del Sur de California. En noviembre del 2020 publicó Girl Head, Feminism and Film Materiality, por la editorial Fordham University Press, trabajo que con un rico detalle técnico y de archivo examina 3 lugares de la producción técnica cinematográfica: el laboratorio, las prácticas de montaje y el archivo cinematográfico. Dentro de cada lugar localiza un motivo común: el cuerpo femenino que desaparece, que se transforma en material para ser utilizado en la realización de una película. El libro desarrolla una teoría del género y la materialidad cinematográfica a través de lecturas del cine narrativo, el cine antiguo, el cine experimental y el arte de la imagen en movimiento. Genevieve, muchas gracias por venir acá, por tu palabra y tu generosidad también. Y a ustedes les pido por favor un fuerte aplauso para Genevieve Yue.
Thank you. Thank you, Max, for that introduction. And I'm going to speak with you today about the practice of writing criticism about experimental film. I'm going to address some of its histories because I think we should always understand where we're coming from in order to explore what the possibilities are for the present. And I'll talk a little bit about my own formation, my own biography in this field, because it's certainly not something that I studied or was told how to do. But I also hope that together we can think expansively about what the contours of experimental film criticism look like today, and really what the relationship between writing and filmmaking could be. So not just criticism as a received form of journalistic publication, but perhaps a more engaged sense of what writing and filmmaking what kind of dialogue they could enter into with each other. So I hope that, I'll keep my remarks fairly brief, and I hope that I can't really see anyone, but I hope that we can have something like a dialogue, and I would be very interested in hearing of everyone's experiences and interests and why you're even here this evening to talk about this topic. A bit of a disclaimer, my formation is very North American, and that's only been compounded since I moved to New York City and have a closer relationship with institutions like Anthology Film Archives and Filmmakers Cooperative. So my bias leans very heavily in the kind of traditional American avant-garde film, and I'm very eager to maybe undo or expand some of those assumptions. So I'll say a bit first about my own background, that I came to criticism at the same time that I became interested in programming and doing scholarly work. So my own formation for me, it's just kind of inseparable to think about these three different areas of practice, and they really do feed into each other. So when I'm attending a film festival such as this one, or places like Rotterdam or New York Film Festival or Oberhausen, I'm thinking about works, I'm excited about work that maybe I want to write about in a critical mode or in a more sustained scholarly one. I may want to bring these filmmakers into my classroom as an instructor. And I'm also thinking about the kind of dialogues among films that I might put together in a program at some point or another. So there's a kind of abiding curiosity and again an interest in how these conversations among works take shape that precedes any kind of disciplinary box that I'm putting them in. But generally speaking, I would say that I'm always searching for a form that suits, that feels satisfying to the kinds of questions I wish to ask about works. And when I encounter a film or an art object, I'm often doing so from the perspective of, I try to do it from a very fresh, or what Francis Flaherty called non-preconception. I try to encounter it spontaneously as much as possible, and to imagine the artwork or the film as itself a proposition or a theorization of what the world is or what the world could be, what the limits and possibilities of that might be. So I really like to think of films as generative interlocutors for me. And I can say more about the kinds of forms of writing that I'm trying to develop for myself. There's a book series that I'm working on that maybe I can say a bit more about, but I think when you're in the field of thinking about experimental film, which itself is already so concerned with questions of form, I think it's kind of natural to start questioning the kind of, the formal practice of writing itself as a response to that cinematic experimentation. So I'm going to move, if you could get to the next slide, or maybe. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about the history of experimental film writing. And I think we can probably pinpoint this to the immediate post-war period, which saw, so in the late 40s, definitely by the 50s, the founding of many influential film journals. Many of them started out quite scrappy and small. So this is, the first issues of, these are the first issues of what would later become Film Comment magazine. So we have that in 1962. Next slide, please. We have Cahiers du Cinéma, of course, kind of legendary among film spaces for serious film writing, and populated by young cineasts that would later go on to become filmmakers themselves, notably François Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard. Next slide, please. And the journal I'd like to talk a bit more about today, and the practice, is that of Jonas Mekas and film culture. So in this kind of post-war boom of film periodicals, it establishes a space for the kind of serious consideration of film and also a reconsideration of film history through a particular lens. And I think this is important to think about in contrast to the contemporary landscape, where that kind of investigation into film history is largely happening in the university, in the academy, right? So scholarly inquiry into film history, aesthetics, politics, et cetera. Today we expect to find in a university setting, but in the 1950s and 60s, that hasn't really yet happened, that the academicization, the disciplinary formation of something like film studies doesn't really exist, doesn't come into being until around the 1960s. So truly in the, thinking about back to this post-war moment, these periodicals are the spaces in which serious and rigorous film study is happening. So this is an important place where writing is happening as well. So film culture was started in 1955 and lasted until 1996. It was started by Jonas Mekas and Adolphus Mekas, and was enormously, it had a very small kind of niche readership, but its legacy, I think, looms quite large, not least because Jonas Mekas himself was so important for the development and really flowering of new American cinema, avant-garde film in the United States. Film culture was a place where Andrew Sarris, P. Adam Sidney first got their start writing. They were the kind of early, this is where they were publishing early in their careers. And the kind of editorial intention of Film Comment was to combine analysis and consideration of avant-garde film, like Maya Deren's work or Kenneth Anger, alongside classical Hollywood cinema. So the very first issue has an image of Orson Welles, right? So thinking about the kind of mainstream or narrative cinema in relationship, in dialogue with avant-garde film. And Hayden Guest described this form as a kind of montage technique, right? Already in the editorial intention of Film Comment, there is a kind of montage perspective, an Eisensteinian one, if you want, where these different modes of analysis and different types of films are being brought, they're sitting right beside each other, page by page. And Guest describes this as, actually effectuating a reinterpretation of film history from the point of view of the avant-garde. So his argument, in short, is that with this emphasis on the avant-garde, that becomes the means through which the rest of film history opens up. It centers the avant-garde in relationship and branches out into other areas of film history. One of the guiding missions of film culture, I must say comment, film culture, was to really educate its readership, if not to expand the audience. And that's the expanding the audience piece happens more with Mekas's other endeavor, literary endeavor in The Village Voice, which I'll get to in a moment. But here the idea of film culture really, again, along the lines of filling a sort of, hadn't yet been established a kind of serious space for intellectual inquiry into film. So there's very much a kind of serious engagement with a educating, mission. Okay, so in addition, so if and I'll say of Jonas Mekas, if you don't know who he is or was an enormously important figure for American avant-garde film, as one of the founders of Anthology Film Archives, a prolific writer, and also a true, one of the great 20th century filmmakers as well. So had his, and also a founding member of the Filmmakers Cooperative. So was very much involved in these different institutions, filmmaking, publishing, and exhibition, in the, through the 50s, 60s, and onward. And in fact, 2022, where we are now, would have been his 100th birthday. So an immensely important figure in many ways, and his legacy is felt in different fields of practice. And today I want to talk specifically about his practice as it reflects his writing. Okay, so let's get to the next slide, please. Great. So the Village Voice is where Jonas Mekas published a weekly column called Movie Journal. And you can get, I think it was recently reissued, you can get an edited volume of Movie Journal, which is really excellent. And I'll show some clips from those pages in just a moment. But when Mekas approached the Village Voice in 1958, and the publication was then only 3 years old, so it was a completely new publication. It was meant to be a kind of downtown, arts and culture rag, a kind of alternative to, the kind of more serious New York Times periodicals that you would have, publications. And really inserted himself early in that process and said, you need someone to write about film. So they gave him the job. And for about 20 years, a little less than 20 years, continued to write, had total free reign. He was, actually when he left in 1974, when he stopped writing Movie Journal, it's because it was the first time an editor dared to correct what he had written. So he had previously enjoyed completely unfiltered space in which to express his ideas in writing. Movie Journal is a really fascinating kind of space. Even reading it today, and if you read film reviews regularly like I do, you'll notice that there's a kind of generic form of it. Movie Journal still feels very radical. It's very different. It's very much off the cuff. And I want to give you a sense of what distinguishes Mekas's writing style and his approach, and how we might learn from that in this moment. But let's go to the next slide. So Amy Taubin, who's friends with Mekas and is still writing quite prolifically, I'm just going to read this quote that I have because I think she describes it really well about the impact Movie Journal had, at least on her. And she says, "One has a sense that Mekas is secure in the place from which he speaks, and that he says plainly what's on his mind, without fussing about the niceties of prose, dampening down hyperbole, or tailoring his style to the standards of art criticism or journalism. He wrote about the liberation of movies in a voice that inspired liberation." So I like this last line, liberation of movies in a voice that inspired liberation. Let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so Mekas himself, you see in the pages of Movie Journal, was very much experimenting with form. And I'm breaking this down in 4 categories because I'm a professor and I like to make bullet points, but one way of schematizing what I think he's doing. So in terms of style, right, that the articles in Movie Journal are responsive, like kind of immediately responsive to the works that he's writing about. They're kind of informal, there's a kind of spontaneity to the way that he's writing that doesn't feel burdened, let's say, by providing, a kind of exhaustive, encyclopedic rundown of a director's previous works, or what the case might be, right? It's like a conversation, just having a kind of direct response to a film, kind of a breezy openness. You can see, and here's the second point, there's a kind of reflexivity at work too, that Mekas in the pages of Movie Journal was actually very frequently commenting on the practice of criticism itself and thinking about, what is the function of criticism? What can a critic do? What should a critic do? What is that relationship, right? And not necessarily settling on one function or another, but keeping that in play. And I think it's interesting to think about how different films, for example, might inspire one to think differently about the function of criticism. I think that's actually kind of exciting to imagine that. Some film could be so powerful to make the critic, rethink the kind of basic premise of what the job is, so to speak. In terms of practice or expression, I think it's interesting for Mekas, especially given that he was also a filmmaker, did not, again, keep these necessarily in separate boxes, but that criticism for him was coextensive with his filmmaking and artistic practice. And again, itself an expression of experimental form. And if you're familiar with his films, like Walden, for example, there's just the feeling of film culture is not an accidental title, I think, for his journal. There's a feeling of a culture, a living culture, living and breathing in his films. You see all different people of that time and place, and you also re-encounter them again in the pages of Movie Journal. So there's that kind of inclusivity that suggests the kind of, even though these are, let's say, distinct practices or distinct modalities, they're obviously coming from the same person, the same perspective. And I think that's really exciting to have a critic that is also a filmmaker in a kind of, and has a meaningful relationship between those practices. And then finally, the last area here is what I would call sharing or dissemination, which is that Mekas was very much thinking about sharing work and making it available to a broader audience, right? It's not the burden of the critic, as he saw it, was not the burden of the critic to make the work available. And in many cases, especially with experimental work, right, we're talking about works that don't screen very often, at least in a theatrical setting. In many places, it's hard to find. But that his goal was to get an audience, get a readership interested in something, to want to find out more, and to, make the demand for having access to those works. And I think he really saw himself as, proselytizing a kind of filmmaking that was so much more expansive than the really quite narrow set of films that typically travel to, that one encounters no matter where you live in the world, right? That narrative fiction filmmaking really only accounts for the small, a very, again, very narrow segment of what the form could be, and that his job as a critic is to keep open, right? To keep reminding us that there's so much more to what this practice is and could be, and what it means aesthetically and politically in all these ways. So keeping that door open, if you will. Okay. I think I have another slide here. Can we advance, please? Okay, actually, instead of this, I want to maybe just play the video file, which is just Jonas himself explaining his time at the Village Voice. Yes. Here we go. So just to give you a flavor here of Mekis's writing style. Especially the last couple of sentences here. It is my duty to bring this cinema to your attention. I will bark about it until our theaters start showing this cinema. So kind of emphatic call to, to bring awareness and hopefully drive interest to this type of filmmaking. Okay. So I think we'll go to the next slide, which is a blank slide, because I'm going to talk just a little bit. Thanks. So to move into the present moment and, serving this, what are the spaces in which experimental film criticism exists? And it's kind of few and far between. And, many of these journals that I mentioned that were founded in the post-war period either ended, like Film Culture, or kind of transformed pretty dramatically. There are other journals that sprang up, like Millennium Film Journal, for example, which was established in 1978 and became very much more a kind of academic, scholarly place of publications, peer-reviewed, et cetera. So I think, as far as there are, basically no, I think, publications solely dedicated to experimental film writing. So what we have are things like academic journals, like Millennium, like Mirage, Moving Image Art and Review Journal. There are plenty of art journals and art adjacent spaces. So as you saw, Art Forum sponsored that video. October is another scholarly place, but has maintained an interest in avant-garde film, and as well as newer places like Four Columns or Art Agenda, where I write sometimes. You have festivals and exhibition platforms like Movies, one of the sponsors of this festival, and many festivals commission writing beyond just their catalogs, right, but just to expand what they're exhibiting. And then here and there are journals that will maintain something of an experimental focus, like, among other things. So I'm thinking of CinemaScope as one place, Reverse Shot. But the fact of the matter is that there are not very many spaces, right? These are not especially popular kinds of films, so it makes sense that there's not especially a kind of a durable publishing platform. But that may, beyond being a hindrance, may also be a freedom for the kind of experiments and form that I'm interested in. But I do want to take a moment to consider the pressures and conditions of writing contemporary experimental criticism, and really look at the spheres of production in which it happens and how it's possible, right? Who is writing and how that writing occurs and what is assumed of the genre. And at least in the United States, which is the context I'm working in, there are no mainstream, full-time film critics employed to solely write about experimental film. Most film critics, period, in the United States are freelance at this point, and certainly those that are employed at a major journal or a newspaper have a responsibility to far more than just experimental work, even if there are people like Amy Taubin, for example, that continue to write about experimental film on occasion. So it's exceedingly rare to have critics even take up the experimental beat. And the fact of the matter is that most critics have to be self-funded to be freelance, right? They usually have to have another source of income in order to make ends meet. And in my own past, I would scrape together what I could to get myself to a film festival so I could watch things and then write about it, usually for a very small fee, and sometimes for no fee at all. So, that's a kind of economic reality of writing, is that there is a kind of, I think, assumed privilege in being able to travel, to watch, and to have the time and space to write in that way. And for me, graduate school was a way of giving myself a kind of buffer in order to think seriously about film work and be able to, find, some funding to make this writing possible. Certainly, I couldn't do the activities I do today without my full-time tenure-track professor position. So I just want to be very transparent about that that's a kind of economic reality that we're dealing with, which is not to say that it's a requirement, but that it is a major factor. But one thing I think is interesting is that, if no one is really assigned to write about experimental film, there's no expectation that there's really any publication about it, we find ourselves in a situation kind of similar to where Jonas Mekas was in 1958 when he approached the Village Voice, right? That there's no one writing about this. Can I have a space? Can you elbow your way into a space or create your own space? So I think that's kind of an interesting proposition that I'd like to follow, because while, again, mainstream established publications are, let's say, very limited, the ability for people to just write and publish on blogs or on social media or their own websites is very different than of course, where we were at the mid-century. Among critics, now speak just generally about film critics, and not even those who write about experimental work, we can say that there's a kind of pervasive conservatism to that form. And by that I don't mean conservative politics, but I mean conservative in the sense that there's a tendency to reproduce the norms of a form in order to, for it to be perpetuated, so that it can reproduce itself, essentially. So it's conservative in style, right? That criticism tends to be more academic. It follows a certain kind of a set of norms that are established by mainstream film critics that you might read in a place like the New York Times or Art Forum. That is erudite and thoughtful and maybe borderline academic. And here I'm going through the kind of criteria set out by Mekas. So in terms of style, we have that kind of consistency. In terms of reflexivity, there is little to no meditation on what the function of criticism is, right? It's I can't think of a single mainstream critic that takes a moment in the pages of writing to consider what it is they're doing, to use that space to talk about that. So it's not especially interested in itself as a form. As practice, it's in fact, criticism tends to be highly professionalized, right? This is an end in itself. It's not, if Mekas's mode was, criticism and filmmaking are branches off the same limb of a tree, a professional critic is just that, right? That's the kind of career path and destination. In terms of sharing and dissemination, the audience is kind of assumed and built in. There's no, there's no special interest in expanding or reaching new audiences. There's a kind of preaching to the choir often, again, in this kind of conservative vein. And I will say for function, and this is based on my own experience, but I have felt as a critic very acutely aware that my writing, let's say about an experimental film, is often going to be the only writing that particular film might receive in the press. And that is a commodity that is extremely valuable, especially if the filmmaker is, let's say, employed in a university system where that review might be added to, would be part of a review or tenure file for promotion, or used in a grant application to secure funding for a next project. So I'm very I've felt sensitive to that, and perhaps in my own writing have let that kind of awareness of function overshadow what I was doing as a critic, and made me really reluctant to say anything very negative about films, because I didn't want to hurt someone's job prospects, essentially. But just kind of the reality that in the kind of scarcity of writing about experimental film, the little writing that does exist assumes this other kind of important function as authenticating a work and shoring up a filmmaker's reputation. But there's more to, obviously, criticism than this kind of conservative set of norms that I've just laid out. Can we have the next slide, please? Next slide, yes. And I wanted just to flag that, one of the dangers of this kind of inherent conservatism of film criticism, in reproducing its assumptions and norms, is that it does tend to leave out a considerable range of filmmakers and filmmaking practices. So Girish Shambhu in Film Quarterly wrote this, I think, wonderful kind of, certainly self-reflexive critique of film criticism, in which he talks about the influence, what are the downsides to reproducing this emphasis on auteurism, right? And what it ends up doing is that it relies on, white, cis, hetero, male auteur filmmakers with established reputations, and tends to exclude, right, to leave on the margins people of color and women filmmakers and the work that they produce, right, and other models for production. And I think to think beyond even what Girish is sketching out in his polemic here is that that kind of auteurist model, again, also privileges narrative filmmaking and leaves and excludes and makes smaller these less easily categorizable forms of filmmaking practice. So really I'm inspired by this piece as a call for rethinking, again, the practice of film criticism, of film evaluation, to be more inclusive, to be more experimental and a bit wilder in who gets talked about, who's brought into the conversation. So I think I'll conclude my remarks and we can open it up after this. But I want to, the last section here is to think about, what would a form of writing responsive to experimental work look like? What would that be, right? If there were no obstacles, no financial constraints, if there were unlimited time, what form would that take? And I think we don't think through those kinds of questions enough. We think about the kind of limitations first, but I want to just create a space for thinking about the possibilities of what we would even want for that criticism. And again, I'm going to return to Mekis because he's visionary, I think, and take some cues from him. So let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so I'm not going to read the whole slide, but I'll give you a moment to just read some of it. And here I just want to draw your attention to the first sentence of the second paragraph. And he says, if the critic has any function at all, it is to look for something good and beautiful around him. So to seek out the good and beautiful, right? and that's like a particular expression of his values, and he mentions that in the video too. Not being interested, simply not interested in works he didn't like, but wanting to celebrate, so to kind of amplifying work in a vein. Next slide, please. So in this one, he says, the trouble with our cinema is that we have film critics and film reviewers. We are taking our newspapers too seriously. It is a disaster. So to kind of deprofessionalize the practice of criticism in film writing, right? To make it less precious, to make it less serious, to open it up. And then the third and final slide here. I'll give you a moment to read this. There's so much in this one. I think this is a really beautiful entry. I like that he talks about rambling. Like, it's not tight writing at all. He is rambling, but it's poetic, right? And it leans into all these areas of things that interest him, leaves and filming and conversations with friends. And there's a humility to this piece in his attitude that I also admire, where he says, where is this one? In the second paragraph, right? He says, I don't know what any movie amounts to. I'm looking more for some light behind it, behind the images. I'm trying to see the man. And I like this also, that there's a kind of, especially with experimental work, that can be so challenging to write about, right? Just even in the very basic description of what it is you're seeing. It's a hand-painted film, or it's processed chemically, or it has a structure that you have to describe formally or materially before you can even get a handle on what it is. To not know what any movie amounts to is that kind of fundamental humility before the object, that there's nothing to take for granted as you encounter it, but to search for something behind it, some kind of light. But I think we should wrap up. I think I'm getting the cutoff signal. So thank you all for your attention. Thanks for coming tonight. Thanks.